Support Lightning Debate on Patreon.
Hi guys, it's Jeff here, coming at you with a different type of video. This time I'm going to be switching over to public forum with doing the new topics breakdown for the public forum topic for this month. Alright, so let's just get right into it. So the public forum topic for this month is going to be the United States should accede to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea without reservations. So what's that mean? So the United States portion, I'm pretty sure it's fairly self-explanatory. It just means that the topic is confined to the U.S. and that U.S. interests and impacts come before any other nation's impacts unless those impacts are intertwined with the U.S. interests and impacts. For example, if the U.S. has a relationship with another country and that the resolution will cause that relationship to be weakened, which leads to decreased trade, and that hurts the U.S. economy. See, that would be an impact or interest that would be pertinent to the U.S., even though that impact or interest affects another country. All right, so vocab with the resolution, accede, that means to agree to. And the second one is without reservation, meaning without constraining factor or condition for agreement. So these implications have really big impacts onto the debate, and it really skews it, in my opinion, toward the con side of the debate, because what happens is because he says that you have to have the United States agree to the convention without reservation, that means the pro has to prove that there's absolutely nothing wrong with the UNICLOS, which with anything in debate is nearly impossible. You're never going to find a perfectly sound policy or treaty that has absolutely no flaws, no problems. It's not going to happen. Someone's going to find some flaw. So this becomes a really big problem because since it says without any constraining factor or condition or anything that would make it seem like there's a level of concern over agreeing to the law of the sea, would mean that in order for a pro ballot to be reached, there needs to be no doubt in the judge's mind that you should accede. So if you're a con team and you're running con, the smart thing would do is put an observation saying if there's a 1% doubt, that should justify a con ballot based off the wording of the resolution that we should go without reservation. In fact, you could make a complete con case saying we agree with the sentiment, however, we should have some level of reservations with agreement. There should be some condition for agreement, and that's the reason why you go con. All right. All right, so the second thing is the law of the sea. What is that even? All right, so with the law, what it does really three things. The first thing it does, it extends the ocean borders from what used to be 3 miles from shore to 12 nautical miles from shore. So that is considered a nation's borders under this agreement or treaty. All right, so from that point on when you're 12 miles from the shoreline, that is considered that nation's territory or ocean or territorial waters. The second thing it does is it gives economic opportunity zones to countries within 200 nautical miles from the shore. So within those 200 miles from shore, they have exclusive economic control over those resources that are found in the ocean. So like things like fishing, like fisheries, or oil or natural gas, anything that's within that area, that country that's within that area will have that exclusive economic freedom to use that resource and restrict use of that resource to however they wish. And the third thing it does, it allows for innocent passage for non-military vessels if they travel within another country's border, as long as they do these three things, as long as they let their flag fly, they don't stop, and they don't break that country's laws while they're in their waters. But as long as they do that thing, they're allowed innocent passage. And it doesn't apply for, obviously, military vessels. A frigadier can't just pass on by saying we're passing on by, and just if they do these things. So that's another thing to keep in account. So here's a visual of how it will look. So if you see right here by the arrow, that's where the territorial waters ends in that 12 nautical range. And if you see also on that dotted line right below it, you see that's where the shoreline is considered. The shoreline is considered anything that's considered beyond the farthest line, or like internal waters like bays, are not considered in the length for nautical miles. So it's as far as it goes. You see by the picture, right? So the first thing is the territorial zone. That country controls whatever goes on in that zone, right? The second zone is the continuous zone. So the continuous zone is very much like the territorial waters, but it's more of a buffer between the territorial waters and the international waters, where it acts more as a border where it allows countries to control trade, pollution, immigration, and also allows them, if someone breaks their laws within territorial waters and they try to evade the authorities, it allows them to also use those 12 nautical miles to give chase in order to make sure that they're able to apprehend the suspect if they're trying to give chase to someone who's fleeing from them. All right. The third thing right here, that 200-mile exclusive economic zone, we've already talked about it. And that's basically encompasses also the continuous and the territorial waters. So those 24 miles between the continuous and territorial waters, that's included to 200 miles from the shore. And the last thing right there is the international waters. So that's free waters. No one owns them. Everyone has access to them. That's the three waters. Now, another thing you'll notice on this graphic here is right above the international waters, there's a thing called the continental shelf. We'll talk about that a little later, but that's another important thing when we're talking about why the U.S. might not want to agree to UNCLOS and its stipulations. All right, so now we're getting into it. Why hasn't the U.S. ratified it? All right, so the first thing is the lack of necessity. Most countries who've signed on to the treaty also needed to protect their interest in their waters. They need that exclusive economic zone protection in order to make sure they're able to use their resources, where the U.S. really doesn't need the UNCLOS to protect U.S. interests at sea. Like, they have UNCLOS's United States military is already so large and it has so much funding. It's so dominant that really they're able to control the areas that they're able to use. And also, most of the UNCLOS conventions, the U.S. already technically follows, because if you look at Ronald Reagan's United States ocean policy statement, it basically aligns more or less with the conventions of the UNCLOS treaty and makes the U.S. follow them. But there are still certain things that the U.S. doesn't abide by, and we'll get back to those later. And another thing I want to mention, that most countries who are signed on to UNCLOS also respect the U.S.'s claims to their sea. So there's not really an incentive in order to gain respect for U.S. land or sea territory by signing UNCLOS, because other countries are already offering it or giving it to the U.S. right now in the status quo. So the first thing I want to talk about is royalties and kickbacks as one of the major reasons why the U.S. is not wanting to sign on to it. Because there are the clauses of the treaty. If you try to access resources more than 200 miles from the shore outside of the exclusive economic zone, you have to pay royalties based off the value of the resources to the International Seabed Authority of the United Nations. So it's based off a percentage of how much that resource is worth, or how much mining that resource or acquiring that resource is worth. And this poses a really big problem for the U.S., who happens to have a large oil reserve that happens to be outside of the territories of the economic zone, but happens to also be on the U.S. continental shelf. So because of how large the oil and natural gas reserves are the value of the oil and gas deposits are near the trillions. And it might be more, because the exact size of how much oil and gas are in deposit, how large those oil and gas deposits are, is not really known. However, based off what we already know about the deposits, it could be billions, trillions of dollars worth of natural gas that the United States has to pay royalties on. And as you can see, because of how much that resource is worth, the United States is really hesitant to try to pay royalties to the United Nations on that resource. All right. The second thing is environmental lawsuits. So the treaty also allows the United States to sue member countries over pollution and not keeping up with environmental standards. And many in Congress are afraid that the potential litany of lawsuits coming from the UN against the US and the potentially costs it will cost the American taxpayers so much more money than they're willing to have, and it'll be too much of a hassle to deal with. So they'd rather just not be involved in that. So they'd rather just keep away from signing the treaty. All right, the next thing also happens to be sovereignty. It basically means that the U.S. has way too much ego to let the United Nations tell it what to do. The U.S. happens to be the largest benefactor for the UN, happens to be where the UN's headquarters is located. So the U.S. has almost an ego where they feel that they are superior to the UN when it comes to sovereignty. So the idea of the UN exerting control of the US makes them feel uneasy, makes them feel like they're weak in their image. And also, they're apprehensive to the idea that the conventions could be changed unexpectedly, and they'd rather not be locked into the agreement if they don't have to be. All right, so the next thing is arguments for acceding. So, what are reasons to accede to the convention? Well, first things off is avoiding territorial disputes. Countries like Canada and US have fairly unclear borders when it comes to the north, when it comes to above the Arctic seas. So you're going to see that when countries like Russia and more recently China are aggressively trying to expand its territory in the north or in the Arctic, it's wise for the US to be clear terms with Canada, Russia, and Asia on who controls what seas in that region, because that's where major expansion, and there's been a major expansion push in that region of the world. And it also gives more credence to the US when they denounce countries like China and Russia who aggressively infringe and ignore upon territorial waters and other countries' claims to them, because it would seem pretty hypocritical for the US to say, oh, China, you're not abiding by the laws of UNCLOS, even when the US itself hasn't even signed the treaty. All right. Another thing is avoiding fees. Now, this is little known that the US has to pay an annual fee for not being party to the agreement. The actual sum's not really known, but if you pair this with an argument saying that, okay, the US already follows basically what it is a version of the law of the sea with the United States Ocean Policy Statement by Reagan. So if you say pair those two arguments together, saying, look, you'd rather avoid the fees if we were just going to be doing the same thing anyway. Well, I understand this is fairly a weak argument compared to the potential ramifications of just running something like kickbacks and royalties. However, it gives you some level of response there, because there's very few arguments of specifically to do with things like income for the US out there on the con side, unless you're talking about trade. All right, another thing I thought was interesting right there are environmental regulations. All right, so in contrast with the previous points, talking about how the US is really, really worried about the UN trying to make lawsuits over and over again, the flip side could be, okay, this is actually a positive, because UN oversight could be good for the US to make the US accountable to keep in with environmental standards and stop things like global warming and pollution. All right, here's your trigger warning right here. Trump argument incoming. If you are triggered, then please stop. Just skip to the end. But here it's your daily Trump argument dose. Okay, so do the Trump regime rolling back many environmental policies, including to take out the US out of the Paris Accords, that'll allow for third party to check the US on environmental policy. So that also helps with decreasing things like pollution and global warming. And if you stack the impacts, that could actually be a really good counterplay to potential lawsuits arguments there. And also gives you really good offense, Vince, because it basically mitigates, forces your opponent to try to combat the environmental regulations and how good those would be on the pro. And that's it for this video, guys. Like and subscribe. Follow us on social media and support us on Patreon. Links are in the description. It's been a pleasure making these videos for you guys, and I'll see you guys around. Jeff out.